Hi, welcome to episode 5 on this series on making a remote recorded album. This episode is specifically about compression and gating, specifically pointing towards drum kit. I'll start with the compression stuff and kind of walk through some things, and I'll look at the gating. For those of you that haven't had a lot of experience with compression, it's like anything, it's a tool. And it's a tool to help me control my mix, is kind of how I think about it. And one of the things that I look for is when I need it and when I don't need it. So I'm going to jump right in, and as I do, I'm going to also talk about a couple of definitions and stuff to kind of help those of you that are beginners looking at this stuff. So I'm just going to grab, let's see, so I have my drum kit right here. I'm starting off with the one particular plugin, which is the Lindell plugins, the 80 series, which is a Neve 8080 console simulation. And the reason I'm doing this is because the album, the sound of the album from a production point of view, I want it to have sort of a Neve sound, and that's just a creative choice that I'm making. That said, so where's the compressor? It's right in the middle, right here. So like my EQ, which I showed in previous episode, is coming from two different places. There's a FabFilter Pro Q3, and then there is the filters and EQ pots here on this Neve plugin. So I already covered that stuff. The compressor is in the next strip over right here. And I just want to cover a couple of basic things. Before I jump into certain definitions, I just want to talk about like the drum kit and what I chose to compress and what I didn't. Snare has no compression. The kick has no compression. Hi-hat has no compression. And you're thinking, well, what did you compress? Well, I compressed the toms, and I compressed the overhead just a tiny amount. When I go through each of them, I'll show you what I did there. And why did I not do it on the snare? Because I don't need it. This is a jazz album, so I don't need like a rock album where you want to really squeeze your kick and your snare in a particular way. I want it to sort of breathe and feel as authentic as possible. And I go by my ears. That's something else I'm going to be talking about today. Because when it comes to compressors and the settings within a compressor, you have to use your ears. You can't just go by what you see on a dial, and you can't go by what it looks like. You have to go by what you're hearing. And I'll make it really clear in a little bit why that's important. Let me just go through a couple things, and then I'll jump into specifically something that was compressed. So generally, compressors, there's 4 knobs in general that you're usually dealing with. There's a threshold, which is how loud does something have to be before the compressor starts to kick in. That's all the threshold is. So like right now, you know, my default is like -4 dB. So when it gets to that level of loudness, that's when the compressor kicks in. And then the next knob is the ratio. How much compression are you going to use? And I just want to cover briefly what the ratio means. So for instance, like right now, this ratio that's on this setting right here is a 3-to-1 compression ratio. And what that means is for every 3 dB above the threshold that I set, what the compressor is going to do is it's only going to allow 1 dB out the backside. So as an example, if my threshold here is -4 dB, if it's below -4 dB, it's not going to compress. It's not going to do anything, right? But let's say it's -1 dB, so it's now 3 dB hotter than my threshold. Then that 3-to-1 compressor will kick in, and it will basically do an adjust it to try and allow only 1 dB more. So remember, my threshold's -4 dB. So if it's squeezing it above that point, it's only going to allow 1 more dB. So it's not going to be, if you think about the math, -4 dB plus 3 dB is -1 dB. It's not going to be 1 dB of loudness level. It's going to be -4 dB plus it squeezes it down to another dB. So now it's -3 dB. So the math might be a little confusing. But if I was like hotter, same with the same settings here, if instead of I was at -1, let's say I was at +2 dB as far as a loudness signal that was going into it, that's 6 dB louder than my -4 dB threshold. So it's going to try and squeeze it down to only allow, because this is a 3-to-1 compression ratio, so it works in 3 dB increments. So if it's 6 dB louder than my threshold, it's only going to let out another 2 dB. So instead of -4 dB, it's going to be -2 dB. So hopefully that, is a somewhat clear idea of what a ratio does. If I had a 2-to-1 compression ratio, then it's only, for every 2 dB over my threshold, it lets out 1 dB. So it's a softer compression. And in the case of the Lindell plugin, and some of you might have noticed this already, the ratios are limited. It's just 1.5-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, and 6-to-1, right? There's other compressors out there, and I'll just pop up an example here just so you can kind of see it. This is a Mic DSP plug. It's the ultimate compressor, so it gives you like a bunch of them to look at, which is a great one to kind of get a sense of how compressors are different, which is one of the points I was pointing to earlier about using your ears. The British C compressor that I have up right now. So if you look at the ratio here, it's 1.5-to-1, and then it goes 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 8-to-1, and then it has increments in between, so you can kind of fit in the gaps, versus the notch type thing that we had in the Lindell plugin. If I picked another one, this one, it's like a 1-to-1 compression. It's just a dial where you can go in the cracks again. There's 1.5, so these marks are about 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, 6-to-1, and then there's an infinity over here that's like acting more like a limiter. That's basically saying nothing gets by this level. This SST76 one, the ratio, the lowest end is like 2-to-1, but then it goes to 20-to-1. So notice how those ratios are all different. So here's a ratio where it goes from 1 to 20, right? And the D57 has a completely different thing. It basically doesn't even have the ratios. It just says crush some more tons, right? That's the compression ratio. But instead of giving you numbers, it's just giving you these descriptions. So this is one of the issues with compressors, is like everyone that makes a hardware compressor or a plugin, the knobs all say something slightly different. And that's why it's really super important to use your ears. It has to just sound good to you. It has to feel right. It doesn't have to feel like it's being noticeably compressed. And it depends on what your goals are. If you want it to be compressed highly because you're doing like a screaming lead guitar kind of a thing, and you just want to pinch everything down into a very tight dynamic range, you do you. Go for it. That's part of the sound that you're going for. You really have to kind of look at all these different plugs and try them out and experiment with them, whatever you've got. There's some that come in with Pro Tools or whatever you're using for your DAW, but that's pretty much the ratio kind of thing. The attack is the next thing. So attack and release are the last couple of things I want to kind of cover. So the attack, it's fairly short kind of time frame. So in this case on the British C, it's 1.5 milliseconds to 15 milliseconds. And just so you know the definition of an attack, and I wrote it down because I like the wording of this. There's other people that say something different, but I think this is a little more accurate. So the attack is the length of time that it takes a compressor to apply roughly about 2/3 of your targeted amount of gain reduction. So if you've got a 3-to-1 compression ratio, and I've got a 15 millisecond attack time, then it's going to take 15 milliseconds to apply about 2 out of those 3 dB of reduction. It sounds a little confusing, and if it is, then go back to the thing I've been saying a couple times, which is use your ears. If it sounds good to you, and if it sounds good to the outside world when you test play it for people, then you're on the right path, and eventually you get comfortable with what you like to hear in any of the tools that you use. So that's the attack. The length of time it takes the compressor to apply roughly 2/3 of the targeted amount of gain reduction. So that's what the attack does. To put it simply, it has a range on this particular compressor of 1.5 milliseconds to 15 milliseconds. So it's either doing it, applying that amount of compression slower or faster. And one of the reasons to go for a slower attack time is the slower attack time means that the initial transient, like if you're using a snare drum, the attack of the snare is not going to be compressed. It's going to be more after the fact. So you sometimes hear a little more clarity in the attack transients when you use a slower attack. Some things you just want to like get right to business and do a fast attack and just compress it and squeeze it like that. So it's a matter of taste for artists. The release, in this case on the British C, it's 150 milliseconds to 1.5K milliseconds, which is like a second. 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So that's 1.5 seconds. So the recovery, or, it's used more commonly, the release knob. The definition that I really like is the release is the time that it takes the compressor to restore 2/3 of what it had reduced with the gain to the compressed signal. When the compressor kicks in, it's applying gain reduction. And then when it's recovering, it's restoring from what it reduced with the gain back to a less compressed or a non-compressed kind of signal. And it all depends on how much audio is coming through your threshold, if it's meeting the threshold or not. And it's this back and forth. It happens simultaneously in the sense that it's attacking and compressing your gain that's coming in, or it's recovering from it and it's going back and forth. How you set your attack and your recovery or your release knobs, how you set your threshold are super important. And it's interesting because it's like some people think it's just picking the ratio to see how much you want to compress something, how much you want to squeeze something, but it's not necessarily that, in my opinion. I think it's this blend. The art of it is trying to find that sweet spot between where the perfect threshold is, the compression kicks in so it's really pleasing to you, and then how fast it goes in to that gain reduction with the attack, and then also how quickly it recovers, and also how that all dances back and forth. So it's, in some ways it seems like it's this giant mystery and it's complicated. In other ways, it's like if you just trust what your ears are telling you, I think that's a great place to start. So that's the general things about the setting. And just to kind of show you some other stuff. So like here, so the British C went from 150 milliseconds of release to 1.5 seconds, right? But the over easy one here goes from 40 milliseconds to 4 seconds. So like I mentioned before, the knobs between different plug-in makers and between different hardware makers of compressors, it's all different. So you just need to use your ears and go with what you think sounds good to you. All right, so that's general compression overview. So I am going to put my headphones on and then I'm going to play some of these things just so we can kind of hear what's there. So I'm just going to start with the kick, and I'm going to pick a section that is busy drums. So let's do the flail stuff. All right. I'm just going to the kick. So here we go. So this is what's coming in the microphone plus the EQ that I did to it. Right. And you can hear kind of off a little more in the background, you hear the overhead cymbal kind of stuff that sounds a little muted, and the snare, but the kick is predominantly what's in front of you. So do I need to compress that? I don't think so. And in jazz, one of the things that you're looking for is you're looking for a really large dynamic range. So I want to keep that as is. If I feel like I need to control it later when I get to my final mix, I might put just a tiny amount of compression on it. It just depends, because you're talking a big band album. You know, like how does the drum kit compete with 20 horn players? You have to make those kinds of choices as you're doing your production. So for me, the drum sound is, the bass drum's completely fine on the compression, so I'm not going to worry about any of that. Okay, so here's the snare set up. I don't have compressor on, and I don't even have a gate on. And let's just listen to what's in the snare track. Okay, my reasoning is exactly the same. I want the dynamic range of all the ghosty notes he's playing with the snare, as well as the hard-hitting kind of stuff that he does. So I want that big dynamic range for now. And I'm not compressing it at all to start with. Gating, I'll talk a little bit about that for the snare. For the kick, I want to gate because I want to not have, I really like hearing the bleed through of the snare and the overhead cymbal sound on that kick drum mic. I want to use the kick drum mic just for the kick drum. So I'll use some gating for the stuff that's quieter in the background, which is the cymbals and the snare, so I can get more kick out of that signal level, and it cleans up my mix a little bit. For the snare, part of a jazz drum kit is that it's not just the overhead mics are the cymbals only. Sometimes it's a blend of other microphones. So I really like the sound of what's happening with the snare drum mic and what it's picking up, but in addition to that, what's going on in the overheads. So for that reason, I'm not gating the snare, and I'm not compressing a snare for the dynamic reasons that I stated before. So let's go forward. All right, here we are on the hi-hat, and no compression again. So no gating either. So this is for the same reason as the snare. All right, so I've got some EQ to kind of bring out certain qualities of the hi-hat, but my mix of the drum kit is a blend of what's happening on that hi-hat track, what's happening on the snare track, and the overheads combined. That's my drum sound. And I kind of pick and choose on the EQ side, kind of how I want to make that work. Let's go to the toms. So toms are much more detailed, and then we'll wrap up with the overheads. So on the toms, there's a couple of things, because I'm using a routing folder in Pro Tools, right? So I've got 4 microphones for toms 1, 2, 3, and 4. Tom 1 is the highest pitch, Tom 4 is the lowest pitch, and I've got channel strips for each of these, right? But then I also have a channel strip on my routing folder. So here's Tom 1's channel strip, but my routing folder also has a channel strip. And it would be similar to like a group fader on a actual mixing console, is the idea of it. One of the things that I did here, which I think is kind of interesting, is I've got 4 different channel strips for the 4 different tom mics, and on each of them, you can see the compressor is not on. The in, if it was on, you'd see the in green, right? So I'm not using the compressor on the channel strips here, but I am using the gate. Notice the gate is on all 4. So I'm on tom 4 here, tom 3, tom 2, and tom 1. If I, just so you can kind of hear it, if I just play tom 1 and solo it, and I turn off the gate, this is what's in the track. Right? So there's a lot of the bleed through on 4 different microphones of overhead stuff. And I just found that it kind of was getting in the way. Now, like I mentioned before, I'm using my snare, my hi-hat, and my overhead microphones to get my general sound of what my drum kit sounds like. And adding the 4 more microphones of that bleed is, it got in the way of clarity in the mix. So I use the gates on the toms so that I can control what's happening. So anytime he's hitting the tom, that's going to pop through. But the overheads, you'll notice when I kick the gate in, is gone. So I'll play it without it. Now I've got it in. Right, so only the stuff that's loud enough to beat my threshold on my gate, which is at minus 13 dB. That's what's gonna kick it into gear, right? So that cleans it up a lot. So if I was to listen to the whole TomRack, and notice how this is the TomRack channel strip. Notice how I'm not even using a compressor in the channel strip. I'll get to why, right? And I don't have the gate on for the routing folder. I'm just, because I've got gates on all 4 toms independently. So if I solo this and play like I'm playing, right? Nice and quiet, just certain things that pop out. And anytime the toms come in, you're going to hear those. You know, so if I hit the drum solo section, a lot cleaner, and then the overhead sound and all that's coming out of the other microphones, the snare, the hi-hat, and the overhead cymbal. So the other thing I want to show you is right here. So I'm using a FabFilter multi-band compressor on all the toms. I was using kind of a typical kind of a compressor on like the overheads, which came from that Lindell plugin. But my snare, my hi-hat, my kick, not compressed, right? But my toms, I'm going to compress with a multi-band compressor, and that allows me to kind of pick frequency band and do different kinds of compression to different frequencies. And so if I'm in the drum solo section, if I'm playing just the toms, now I'm going to bypass it. Not quite as present, right? You hear a little more tone as well coming from the multiband. Right? So what this is doing is bumping up the tonal part of the toms, and this is dealing with the higher frequency, the attack transients and things like that. And then I'm just sort of keeping things nice and easy in the middle, because sometimes those mid-range kinds of frequencies can get in the way. So I'm just using a little bit of multiband on the toms to just get a little more clarity, a little more definition out of the toms, and that's all I'm doing. So as far as like mixing 4 dynamic kinds of styles of music, orchestral music, in jazz and stuff like that, there's a lot more intimacy as far as things are a little quieter than, let's say, a pop song. So even though sometimes a pop song has quieter moments, there's a lot of times where it just kind of kicks into high gear. So in these kinds of styles, you don't have to do a ton of compression. I'm just doing very light kinds of stuff to just create a little more definition. That's all I'm doing with the compression. Let's take a look at the overheads. So I'm using compression, but check it out. So my threshold is really tiny. It's like minus 18 dB. So it's really low, which means that the compressor will kick in sooner. But my compression ratio is 1.5 to 1. So it's only doing a little bit of squeezing as far as applying gain reduction. And it's just to smooth out the overhead sound a little bit. And I'm not doing any compensation to the gain. It's at 0. One of the things that's different in the release knob here, it's called the recovery here in this case, for the Lindell is it's just got notches. It's set 100 milliseconds, 400, 800, 1.5 seconds. And then auto is sort of just a feature that's sort of built in, and I'm not sure what the algorithm is that they're using. But you know, when I switched to that, I could pick a particular amount of time for recovery, and if that sounds good to me, I'm going to go with it. But when I was trying the auto out, I liked the way it sounded, so I just stuck with it. The other thing I should mention about attack times when it comes to this particular plugin, so there's no attack knob, right? There's literally a toggle switch here, and it's this button that says fast. So it's got like 2 presets, and even in the manual, it doesn't really say what specifically it is. It's just that the fast attack button, when it's on, just means that it's faster. It doesn't say it's like, you know, 0.5 milliseconds to 15 milliseconds if it's off. It's just like it's faster than when it's off. So you don't really know. There's nothing that I see in the specs that tell me what that setting is. If they were trying to do something that was part of a Neve console, then maybe what's the specs in a Neve console will be helpful. There's no gating on the overheads either, because a lot of it, especially in a jazz setting, it's the way that the cymbals ring out and the way the sound in the room, the drums fill the room. That's part of the drum set sound in a jazz setting. So I don't need to gate things. And it's honestly, for overheads, I would usually never gate, because you can sometimes it can sometimes make things sound kind of choppy and not very pleasant. So I just avoid it. It's all generally, as far as production point of view, it's all about control and what it is that you want the audience to hear, or how you want them to hear it. And if it's a special effect, maybe gating overhead cymbals, on one tune in your entire career is like an interesting choice. But for purposes of what we're doing on this sort of setting for jazz kit, nah, it works fine. Let me just do an on-off kind of thing, so you can hear. Here's the cymbals with compression. Right, so that's with the compression in on the overheads, and you can hear some of the toms in there. So that's without it. It's slightly louder. Right, but you can hear the snare drum in there. You can hear a lot of stuff coming through those overheads. I just happen to like that a little bit more. It's just a little bit more where I can kind of hear everything a little bit better when I do the whole kit, which is what I'm going to do next. So now I'm going to play the whole kit. All right, so here's the way the whole kit sounds during this drum solo section. Okay, so one thing to notice here, the metering here on this particular plugin is kind of interesting. So you've got your input signal, which is the left side of the in-out dial here. The output is what's coming out, and then the gain reduction here for the compressor is, it shows you when it kicks in, and you can see this is good to see what a compressor actually does, because you can see when it's applying gain reduction, because this little meter is creeping upwards, right? And when it's restoring from the reduced gain, you'll see that the meter go down. And so let me play it again and just take a look at that meter so you can kind of see what it's doing. That's kind of a cool kind of way to kind of see exactly what's happening. Okay, so that's the compression side of things. I touched a little bit in talking about the gating, but I want to go into just a little bit more detail. Let's jump back to the kick drum, and I'm going to turn off the whole group thing, right? So just kick drum gating. So right now I've got a fast attack on the gate. Threshold's at -20, so once it gets above or below 20 decibels, then it's going to start kicking in. And then the range is like how much do I bring it out. So you can bring out just a little bit and still have some background ambient stuff, or you can bring out a lot. So I think I have it at 30 decibels. So it takes out 30 decibels. If there's anything below that, you might hear some of it. But in the case of the kick, I don't think you do. So I'm going to play it again with it in and then with it out. Okay, so here's that same section, just the kick. Right, so there's a little bit coming through. And if I wanted less of that, yeah, I basically up my range so that it covers more, and then I could raise the threshold a little bit. So let me just play it again. Right, and you can kind of hear where the gate's kicking in. Part of the thing is you can notice that, like there's some of the gating, it just didn't sound that great when it's kind of cutting in and out. But you can play around with it. Sometimes you can find a sweet spot where it actually works out pretty well. But for what I did on this one, let's go back to my default. I just felt this worked fine for that section. In most of the other sections in the tune, it works completely good. So this is with the gate in again. Right, versus taken out completely. So that's kind of what's happening on the kick side of things. If I go to the snare, let's see, did I use any gate? I did not. I didn't use any gating on the snare. Didn't feel it needed it because, like I said, the snare and the hat and the overheads were part of the sound. So I'm going to skip over that. So just showing you. Here's the hat. There's no gate on. And then for the toms, I don't have any gate here individually, but, or I'm sorry, I don't have a gate on the routing folder, but on every individual one I have it. So if I was just a solo tom one, the idea of the individual gates, I could gate the whole TomRack, but here's where you'll notice if I go and click through each of the 4 toms, notice specifically that look for what the threshold value is. So we're at minus 13.1 with a range of 40 dB, right? So for tom 1, and it's the same for tom 2, for tom 3, and for tom 4. So my threshold is the same, and my range of how much it's gating is the same. But in case you didn't see it, look at what's different. Look at the recovery times. So if I go to tom 1, I've got a recovery of about 0.77 seconds. On tom 2, I think it's about the same. For tom 3, we're at 1 second. And then for tom 4, I slipped it down to 0.67 seconds, so 2/3 of a second. There's a reason why I did that, and the reason was it sounded better. So for each of those individual toms, they have different characteristics, and like why is tom 4 doing that? I don't know. Let's find out. So this is tom 4, bar 182. Right, so that's the lowest tom, and it's got, and if I turn that off, you can hear what's happening. It's got a big long ring out, right? And as far as the mix, does that cloud up the mix when it gets all added together and blended in with all the other microphones? So for me, I just wanted a little more control over that, and that was like the tom 4. Everyone's a little different. So if I play through the whole TomRack together with all the different gates kicking in, like you heard before, it sounds fine. So for me, that's totally cool as far as what my whole kit sounds like. If I just play the whole kit. So that's compression and gating as far as what I did specifically with Peter's drums on this particular tune in this project. And one of the things that I hope is a takeaway for y'all is when you've done this for a while and you've gained experience in working with whatever the tools are, you're gaining confidence. You're gaining more of a sense of knowing what you like, what you don't like, what your tastes are. And I just encourage you guys to experiment and try things out and try different kinds of compressors. Like sometimes you can use like the junkiest, cheapest little like compressor on a particular thing, and it's like the perfect compressor for that particular snare drum on that particular song. You know, being open to allowing that experimentation to happen, I think is like one of the joys of the kind of work that we do. Is, you know, we get to play with toys and try and do really cool things and make people happy as far as listening to the stuff that we do. So that's why we do this. So thanks for checking this out. Next episode, I'm going to talk about reverb and levels of how I set levels up on the drum tracks on this tune. Thanks a lot.